Welcome, everyone. I can see that people are slowly trickling in. We're going to give it a minute or so for people to join. But in the meantime, feel free to grab your drinks or snacks before we get started. All right, it is 6:32, so we are gonna get started. I already see a question in the chat. This webinar will be recorded and we will have a recording shared after the webinar ends. All right, welcome everyone to our Building Resilience Across the Charles River Watershed virtual webinar. My name is Dira, and today we have some really great speakers to talk about one of our great regional flood modeling projects. And first thing we will do is cover the agenda. So next slide, please, Julie. All right, so for tonight's agenda, we'll have a little bit of background about the Charles River Watershed Association. We will then meet our speakers for the night, who will give an overview of this regional project and collaboration. You'll get to see some really exciting project results from our flood model and the community engagement that we've been able to do in person this year, which was really exciting. But before that, some logistics to cover for tonight's webinar. We will be having some poll questions throughout the webinar and they will pop up on your screen. I know sometimes it gets a little funky when you have a full screen on or even a double screen, so just keep an eye out for when poll questions come on. You do have an option to turn on subtitles by clicking the closed caption that should be at the bottom of your screen. If you click next, Julie, I think I have a quick little image about, on how it should look like for your screen. And then throughout this presentation, please feel free to ask or include your questions for the speakers in the Q&A button, which looks like, if you click next, Julie, should just look like a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as well. And if you have any technical issues, you can use the chat function to message the host, and my colleagues Julia and Colin will be able to help you. You can also email Charles at crwa.org, and that will send an email directly to Julia as well. And hopefully we can help anyone who needs any extra technical support. And again, we are recording tonight's webinar, so you will be receiving a recording of this webinar in both English and Spanish in the next week or so. All right, so many of you may already know about us, but if you are new to our organization, we are CRWA, or the Charles River Watershed Association. We are one of the oldest watershed organizations in the country, and we were founded by a group of residents who were concerned with the state and conditions of the Charles River at the time. We work with different federal and state agencies, as well as the 35 states, 35 towns and cities in the watershed. We have an interdisciplinary staff. Oops, I think. Screen sharing.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Well, that was my bad.
No worries. I know we're like 2 years into Zoom, but technical things still happen. But yeah, so as I was saying, we do work with federal, state agencies, as well as the 35 watershed towns and cities. We have an interdisciplinary staff with various backgrounds ranging from policy and environmental science. And we cover a number of program areas, including river science and restoration, stormwater solutions, and climate adaptation. And we've come a long way since the days of the song Dirty Water. However, as you will learn today, there is still a long way to go in terms of climate change, or the climate that is changing, that puts a stress on our current conditions. Next slide. But before we delve into the project, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. At CRWA, we humbly acknowledge that the CRWA resides on occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag peoples. We recognize and acknowledge them as the past, present, and future traditional caretakers of the land in which our work carries across. Next slide. And before we start with today's topic, I would like to introduce our speakers for the night. The first speaker of tonight will be Julie Wood, who is the Deputy Director of CRWA. Julie is a longtime member of CRWA staff, having joined the organization in 2007. Julie oversees CRWA's science program, which includes climate change adaptation, stormwater program, our river science, and education and outreach. She is a project manager for the Charles River Flood Model Project, which is what you'll be hearing about tonight. Julie provides support for CRWA's advocacy work and often presents our work at conferences with local officials and at public events. Julie has a BA in mathematics from Boston College and a master's in environmental science from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Our second speaker is Dr. Indrani Ghosh, who is the resiliency technical leader at Weston and Sampson. Indrani has more than 14 years of experience as a water resource engineer and as a technical lead in climate change resiliency projects. Dr. Ghosh has worked with numerous municipalities and public agencies to model their impacts from coastal and stormwater flooding using the best available and most appropriate sea level rise, storm surge, and rainfall projections. She has extensive experience integrating climate projections in hydraulic models and in design of urban stormwater and sewer systems, and is frequently invited to be part of panel discussions on climate risk and resiliency around the region. Our third speaker is Clara Rondelli. Claire currently serves as a conservation agent and open space planner for the town of Natick after spending 4 years in the conservation office of the city of Newton. She dedicates her time to educating the residents of Natick about wetlands, stormwater, invasive species, and all things environmental, and has greatly enjoyed being a municipal representative in the CRWA Climate Compact while working in both Newton and Natick. She has worked on several climate plans and projects in both communities and is a certified sustainability professional through the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure. Claire has her bachelor's in environmental science from Northeastern University. And our last speaker for the night is Leigh Munir, who is Cruise Project Coordinator. Leigh is fairly new to the staff at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, but she's been volunteering with them since 2018, both as an organizer for their annual Climate Interface Summit and member of a local crew chapter in Somerville. She's had the honor of serving her community in many capacities, including public education, songwriting and performance, community organization, grant management, and even ecological landscaping. She feels most joyful and in flow when she gets to be creative, curious, and connected to nature, and when she can support others in accessing these as well. With her stellar team at CRWA, Leigh will be coordinating much of the community engagement work related to the Charles River Flood Model Project, with her eye and heart on ways to engage people throughout the watershed authentically, equitably, and through mutual learning. And with that, I will pass it off to our first speaker, Julie Wood.
Excellent. Thank you, Dira. And thank you to our participants for joining us this evening. As Julie said, as Dira said, I'm Julie Wood, Deputy Director at Charles River Watershed Association, and I'm the project manager for this program for CRWA. So my job tonight is to really kind of let you guys all know what we've been up to, and then hand it off to my co-speakers to give some of our exciting results, as well as their perspectives and what's to come. So to start off with some background, the Building Resilience Across the Charles River Watershed Association initiative, Watershed Initiative, is a regional collaboration across our watershed of 20 communities coming together to work to address the impacts of flooding that we know are coming from our changing climate. This all stemmed from the organization of the Charles River Climate Compact back in 2019. We brought communities in our watershed together, and they identified flooding as an issue that they really wanted to work on together as a community. What happens in one community likely impacts the flooding in their neighboring community, since water's flowing from upstream to downstream. So the watershed scale is really the ideal scale to look at flooding. In 2021, about a year ago this time, we developed version 1 of the Charles River Flood Model. Tonight, we're going to tell you about some of the work we've done since then to update it to our version 2, and some of the lessons learned about what we know about what flooding is coming and what we can do to plan for it. The project team is primarily represented here this evening. We have us, Weston and Sampson, CRWA, and then we have Claire from NADIC representing the 20 municipalities that are actually part of this project. So we are going to take a quick pause for a poll break. If you've been to one of our presentations on this initiative before, some of these questions will look familiar to you. We like to keep questions consistent to see if the answers are consistent. So poll question 1, have you had a chance to check out the Charles River Flood Model online? So hopefully some of you have, and if you haven't, hopefully you will. And question 2, how concerned are you about the flooding impacts of climate change in your city or town? So we will give folks just about 30 seconds or so to respond to the poll. All right, we got some answers still coming in. All right. All right, let's close that down and share those results. All right, so about half of you have checked out the Charles River Flood Model already. Half of you have that to look forward to after tonight. And we have the majority of folks in attendance are either extremely or very concerned about flooding. Some of you moderately and not much. Excellent, great. So that was good practice with the poll feature, because our next poll is going to be a little bit more in depth. We have a few more questions coming up, and we really want your feedback on some of the work we did. All right, get that out of the way. Okay, so as I mentioned, we developed the version 1 of the Charles River Flood Model about a year ago. And since then, we have been working on updating it, also expanding its extent. The Charles River Flood Model covers the middle and upper Charles River watershed. And this is essentially the river area upstream of Boston and Cambridge, as Boston and Cambridge already had their own municipal scale models when we started this project. We've been able to identify and design some specific flood mitigation projects, which we'll be sharing with you. We also tested a bunch of flood mitigation strategies, actions we could take all across the watershed to see what their impact is on present day and future flooding. We are currently drafting a watershed flood reduction plan, and we'll be looking for your feedback on that. So that's that second poll I mentioned, as well as potentially some follow-up emails. And then we've done a lot to engage residents. The initial construction of the Charles River flood model happened really at the height of COVID. We did not have a lot of chance to engage with people directly. So that was exciting to do this round. So we'll be talking about that as well. So just a really high level overview of what we've accomplished. I mentioned we updated and expanded the model. We received over 40 flood mitigation project ideas and suggestions across the watershed. We narrowed that down to 3 of them, which we'll show you the designs for this evening. We had public input sessions in each of those communities specific to those projects. We even have already submitted some of those project ideas for funding because we're really ready to take some actions here. As I mentioned, we had some in-person events this year, very exciting. Great to have that direct conversation with people. So Leigh will be talking about that. More modeling of flood reduction scenarios, some important lessons learned from that Indrani will be talking about. And also just continued great online engagement. So this is actually the 4th virtual event we're doing on this project. Great registration, great attendance, and we've also had great responses to all of the online surveys we've done as part of this project. So I thank you all for that. So the results we're sharing tonight, the updated flood projections, what we call our no action scenarios. What can we expect from flooding from our changing climate if we don't do anything about it? And then we also have our action scenarios or our flood reduction solution scenarios. So Indrani will be sharing the results for those. I mentioned we have 3 site-specific projects that we'll be talking about. Those are Hardy Pond in Waltham, Albemarle Field in Newton, and Oakland Park in, it's actually in Medway, sorry, typo on the slides. Highlights and lessons learned from community and engagement. So I am just gonna set the stage to lead us into these results. So the watershed scale results. These are the results where we run the model for the entire study area, the upper and middle watershed. And the model is really just a computer simulation of what happens when it rains in the Charles River watershed. That's all it is. So it's fancy and technical, but that's essentially what it is, the computer simulation of what happens when it rains. So because climate science is evolving, our understanding of what is coming is evolving, we did update our design storms or the rain storms that we ran through the computer simulation or the model to match with the best available recommendations. Believe it or not, they changed even from a year ago. So we updated our rainstorms and ran some new rainstorms. We did that for 2 timelines, our nearer term, which was 2030, which was favored by the general public in surveys, and then the longer term, 2070 to 2100, which was favored by our municipal partners in outreach surveys. And then we also have some new flood reduction scenarios, as I mentioned. These are also done across the watershed, and it's a hypothetical look at actions we could take. So what if we did this? We can put it in our computer model. The computer model can tell us the impact on flooding. And so those were selected with your input as far as what categories folks would like to see. And then our municipal partners helped us to select the specific actions. Okay. And then we're also going to be showing you results from these site scale planning efforts. We prioritized 3 projects from those 40 that I mentioned we received. The 40 are we still keep the full list, and we're hoping to advance these as we go. But for tonight's presentation, we did narrow it down to 3. What were we looking for? Large areas, landowner support, potential for near-term implementation. We really want to move to some flood reduction actions. 2070 may seem like it's far away, but we need to start moving. I think that'll be a takeaway you'll all come home with after tonight's presentation. So we were looking for things that could get going in the near term, had community support, would protect downstream populations, particularly those that are in more vulnerable, residents that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as those living in environmental justice neighborhoods. And then there was also strong public support in general for projects that would provide or protect critical habitat or provide habitat connectivity. So that was important to folks. So that's the background. And with that, I will pass it off to Indrani to share the results.
Thanks a lot, Julie. So as Julie mentioned, we had a few updates with this year's updated project and model runs. One of the things that was updated are the rainfall projections, which we are calling as design storm projections. And essentially, the state has more updated rainfall projections that have been produced by Cornell University as part of EEA's Climate and Hydrologic Risk Project, and these projections have been integrated into the state's Climate Resilience Design Standards Tool version 1, which is now available and accessible for everyone. So in keeping with the best of available information that the state has, we deemed it was prudent to use those same rainfall projections in the updated Charles River flood model. And the new projections are actually showing more are projecting to have more rainfall for the design storms. So for example, the 100-year storm of today is likely to be the 25-year storm by 2070. And also the 25-year storm of today could be the 10-year storm by as early as 2050. As Julie mentioned, the Charles River flood model was not run for the 2050 planning horizon. However, the rainfall projections are available now for the 2050 planning horizon. So we also talked about, Julie mentioned that the model itself, the Charles River flood model itself, has been revised and updated significantly with a lot of input. Thank you all to the stakeholder representation and to the member communities that have participated in providing us information to make this model better and more accurate of on-the-ground observed conditions. We consider this model to be a living document. So with every update, we try to make sure that the drainage infrastructure, the information related to the streams, to the floodplains, are more representative and are getting more and more details are being incorporated into the model. So the phase 1 model that was used and the flood viewer for which went live last June will be updated, has been updated, and the updated flood viewer will go live by the end of this month. But now we have more accurate stream channel and storm drain data, additional floodplain data, and then the additional rainfall guidance that we just talked about has been incorporated into the model. And really the benefits of this updated living model are that it's providing more accurate information related to flooding, where the flooding is, how deep, how extensive that flooding is, which is helping the communities take more informed decisions and helping develop more resilient communities. That information is also helpful for the communities, for you all to decide where you would need to prioritize, where flood mitigation projects would need to be prioritized. And again, greater model detail helps make more informed decisions, as well as really being able to prioritize capital planning efforts and have flood infrastructure improvements be driven by the findings of that model. So we ran those updated, the updated model as well as the updated rainfall through the model. And what we are seeing here are the model shows maps that basically will show how deep the flooding is, how extensive it is. And we're seeing with the updated results that about 14,600 acres in the upper and the middle Charles River watershed, which is really the focus of this model that covers over 270 square miles. Of that, 14,600 acres are likely to be inundated from the 100-year storm by 2070. And you can see here that the effects are also definitely felt in the 2-year storm. And it gives a magnitude of how much the flood extends from the 2-year, the 10-year, and the 100-year compared to the present and the future are likely to increase. This slide shows a comparison of the extensive flooding at this location in the watershed from the 100-year storm. The left panel here shows the storm, the 100-year storm from present day. These are the present day NOAA Atlas 14 numbers, which show about 8.2 inches of rain falling in this part of the watershed and over a period of 24 hours. The 100-year storm by 2070 is likely to drop 11.1 inches of rain over 24 hours. The colors in blue correspond to depths of flooding. The lighter the shade of blue, the shallower the flooding, the deeper is deeper flooding, and these are depths of flooding above existing ground elevation. The model also includes, in addition to the flood extents and in addition to showing which drainage infrastructure, which stream channels have been included in this model, it also shows critical infrastructure where the flooding is with relation to schools, with relation to fire stations, with respect to senior centers, with respect to other critical facilities. The locations of those facilities across the communities that are in the model are available and and those impacts can be assessed using the results of the model. So then moving on to the results for all the no action scenarios are available again in the model that will go live. The updated viewer will be available for you all to access post June 30th. But we really, for the purposes of this discussion today, we want to focus more on the solutions, the nature-based solutions that have been run at the watershed-wide scale using the input that we received from the stakeholders. So we have a total of 8 scenarios that have been run in the model that cover nature-based solutions related to green stormwater infrastructure, where we are considering storing more runoff under near impervious surfaces where much of it originates, reducing impervious cover strategically across the watershed, increasing storage in existing ponds and water bodies, increasing storage in existing wetlands, where land conservation can be applied. But we have interesting results that show what lack of land conservation can do. And then the regulatory implications of how better and more informed stormwater policies coupled with new development can potentially mitigate the impacts of development. And so if land were to be developed, if undeveloped, unprotected land were to be developed using more stringent stormwater policy, what would that effect look like? And then also looking at the effects of removal of dams to lower flood levels upstream. For the purposes of the discussion today, we're really focusing on the top 2 scenarios that gave the most promising results in terms of flood reduction. And the first one was really the first scenario that we talked about, wherein we are modeling out the impacts of what if, from 50% from impervious cover, from half of the impervious cover in the watershed were to store the 2-year storm of the future, that is by 2070, which is generating about 4.5 inches of rainfall. If that amount of storage can be accommodated in half of the impervious cover of the watershed, we are likely to see the total decrease in runoff volume for the 2-year storm of today by 47%, for the 2-year storm of the future by 26%, and for the 10-year storm of today, the volume is likely to decrease by 20% and 12%. And in terms of flood volumes, in terms of million gallons of flooding, this strategy is likely to mitigate approximately 1,600 million gallons of flooding for the 2-year storm of today, and approximately 1,660 million gallons of flooding for the 2-year storm by 2070. So definitely a considerable reduction in flood volume can be achieved by strategically storing more rainfall in the watershed in approximately half of impervious cover in the watershed. The next top strategy that emerged from the selection of the strategies that were evaluated was that the impervious cover, if impervious cover is reduced by 25% across the watershed, we will likely see 450 million gallons of flooding less for the present day 2-year storm, and approximately 550 million gallons of less flooding for the 2-year storm by 2070. The map on the right here also shows how this strategy responds across different basins within the watershed. So the areas that are, the colors here correspond to the percent reductions. The darker colors correspond to more reduction in flood volume. So for example, the Charles River over here, the Charles River Basin at Dover, Wellesley, the Stony Brook in Watertown, and some of the other blue, the areas in blue here are the ones that are likely to experience more reduction. And then this is an interesting plot that shows across the strategies that were evaluated what the reduction in flood volume is. And we're seeing that storing the 2-year storm by 2070 from half of the impervious cover in the watershed is likely to have the greatest flood reduction potential. The bar plots here correspond to the different scenarios that have been run in the model at the watershed-wide scale, and they correspond to the total flood volume that is generated. Green here corresponds to baseline 10 years, so a present day 10-year storm. This dark blue corresponds to a 10-year storm by 2070. And then as we can see here, all of the strategies that we ran at the watershed-wide scale, none of them were able to mitigate the effect of climate change. So none of them is really being able to lower the flood volume to be anywhere close to what we have present day today. So really whatever we've done, we need to do more of it, and we need to do probably a combination or many of these together. And this is a snapshot that shows how the strategy is different across different subbasins within the watershed. So not all subbasins, what works for one subbasin may not work for the next subbasin in the watershed, because we have a variety of land uses, we have a variety of topography and changes of drainage infrastructure across the watershed. And this shows, for example, the strategy that we just talked about of storing the 2-year storm by 2070 approximately reduces, while it reduces about 30% flood reduction for the Charles River and Watertown, but in another Rosemary Brook subbasin reduces only about 20% of flood volume. So the responses are not equally felt for the same strategy across the watershed. As Julie mentioned, so those were all the watershed-wide strategies. And once we selected screened projects, 40 projects through the screening criteria that Julie had discussed earlier, we got it down to 15 projects, and then we developed the concepts for 3 of those, which we're calling as the 3 priority projects. And the criteria that were used for selecting the projects are listed here. That included site feasibility, flood reduction, community support, and more increased emphasis on biodiversity permitting feasibility, recreation, and co-benefits. And with that, the top 3 sites that emerged are the Hardy Pond in Waltham, Oakland Park, and the Albemarle Field in Newton. So this slide shows the concept that we used for the Hardy Pond location in Waltham, wherein we are looking at increasing being able to provide a multi-stage outlet structure at the outlet of the pond here to aid in flood operations and being able to provide more storage. We're also looking at potentially removing the fill in the existing in these areas highlighted in orange to expand the floodplain and provide more storage, and looking at also additional surface storage opportunities with stormwater BMPs, bioretention, and stabilization. We also considered a storage option. We also considered another concept at the same location where we're also providing additional storage by providing a berm around the pond to increase the storage. We're drawing down the pond by 2 feet and essentially also adding a foot of storage, up to 1 foot of storage as a berm around the pond to increase storage opportunities there. And what we are seeing here are the number of houses or properties that are impacted as a result of this proposed concept are decreasing as a result of this concept. So what we're seeing in light blue is the reduced area of flooding as a result of the proposed concepts that we have run through the model. The area in darker blue is the no action scenario. So for example, for the 10-year storm, if no action was taken, about 8 properties were impacted. But with the concept, we're able to bring that down. With the proposed intervention, that could be reduced to be as low as 1. The next site that we looked at is Oakland Park in Medway, wherein we also looked at a similar combination of underground and surface storage options. The underground options are highlighted here in solid blue, the surface options are here in shades of green, and roof rainwater harvesting over the at this site is shown here in darker shade of blue. This is the community center here, and we're proposing an underground storage tank approximately at this location in the field area here, and potentially looking at surface options of BMPs and bioretention basins around the edges of the field here, as well as around the edges of the community center. The parking lot here can provide additional underground storage. And these were all vetted through the community, and thank you all for your input in providing this concept, the ideas behind the concept. And last but not the least, this is the Albemarle Park in Newton. The city of Newton is already doing a park improvements project at and a planning project over here at Albemarle Park, and the idea was to use an existing project and leverage opportunities for increased stormwater storage and management at an existing project location. So this concept also shows a myriad of options that we are considering or proposing for this location, which range from both subsurface as well as surface options. So we're looking at diverting stormwater from this existing stormwater pipe to underground storage tanks that can hold more, that can store and mitigate the peak flow underneath the playing fields here, as well as looking at bioretention and BMP swales around these locations of the fields to provide additional flood storage. And with that, I will turn it back to Julie to go over the recommendations.
Great, thank you for that, Indrani. Covered a lot of stuff. All right, so building on our lessons from the updated modeling results, we have drafted some initial recommendations. One thing I wanted to mention just before I even get into these, we are going to be looking for your feedback on these, but one thing I wanted to mention before I even get into these is that The scenarios that Indrani demonstrated that were effective, where we're storing essentially this, 4+ inch storm, these are much more aggressive measures than what we're seeing currently in place. So I know not everyone may be familiar with exactly what your community has for local regulations as far as flooding goes. I encourage you to find out, ask, figure it out. But I just want folks to be aware that that is much more aggressive than what is currently in place. So that's just a little reference for folks. Okay, so recommendations. These will also be sort of a living document, things that we will be working to implement as we continue this initiative and this collaboration with our municipalities, with residents, etc. So our recommendation number 1, we are providing in this report a variety of different potential actions, and some of them work better in some places than others. So the results you're seeing tonight, for the sake of time, are shown at a fairly large scale, the watershed wide scale. This is almost 300 square miles, so it's very large. The localized impacts of these in certain conditions, whether it's highly developed areas or less developed areas, can be very promising. So our first recommendation is to really take that into account, match the actions with the specifics of the landscape. Number 2, be aggressive. So I probably already led the stage for that. What we saw tonight, capturing the 4.5 inch storm from half of the impervious cover, that wasn't enough to mitigate the impacts that we know are coming. So we really need to be aggressive. We need to take aggressive action, and we need to start taking aggressive action soon. Solutions will most likely need to be combined and layered. There isn't really one panacea, no silver bullet here. So we need to mix and match. Continue to look for local improvement opportunities, such as the ones Indrani just described. Implement those over time. Again, get started now so that we're planning for these decades to come. Targeting new and redevelopment can present an opportunity. From the watershed scale results we saw tonight, capturing runoff where it is, which is near the impervious cover and the development, is effective. So that's effective. It's one strategy in our toolbox. So thinking of new development and redevelopment as opportunities to build that in, build more flood storage into our landscape is our 5th recommendation. And then number 6, as a planning action, setting flood reduction targets. So working together with the group to figure out what are we really aiming to control for. Is it to try and get it down to present day? Is it to do better than present day? Or are there some areas that maybe can flood and it's still safe because there's no buildings there, no people there. All right, so I am going to launch the poll number 2. We're going to give you a little bit of time on this one. What we're asking you to do here is to go through the recommendations and let us know if you agree, disagree, or don't know or need more information. So we know this is probably potentially more extensive than the Zoom polls you're used to. But if folks would not mind taking a moment to just let us know your thoughts on these recommendations, we would really appreciate it. And we'll give you just a moment to go through that. All right, thank you. I see some responses coming in. So I thank you for folks that are taking the time. I can just review them quickly here. Number 1, take action suited to your area or your community. Be aggressive. Number 2, be aggressive with flood reduction actions and activities. Number 3, layer solutions. Don't rely on one action or activity. So we don't want to do one, maybe take one local action and think we have flooding solved. We would recommend people take multiple actions, come at this from a bunch of different angles. Number 4, identify and implement local flood mitigation projects, like some of the ones we saw today. Number 5, targeting new and redevelopment, especially those impervious surfaces, your buildings, your parking lots, your roads. And number 6, developing a flood reduction target. All right, great. Thank you. So we got some great participation. I am going to go ahead and close the poll. And I am happy to share that we have a number of agrees here. So I won't read the questions again, but recommendation 1, strong agreement. Recommendation 2, still fairly strong agreement. Some folks wanting to know more. Recommendation number 3, unanimous agreements. Same with number 4. Excellent. Number 5, close to unanimous agreement there. And number 6, a little bit more split, but strong agreement for developing flood reduction targets. All right, thank you so much for all of you that participated in the poll. Your work is done. You can just go ahead and listen for the rest of the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Claire.
Hi, everyone. So as I was introduced earlier, I'm the conservation agent and open space planner for the town of Natick. I had the pleasure of being a part of the Climate Compact as both representative of Newton and Natick from when I was working in that community. I'm just going to give a really brief statement about the municipalities that are involved in this project and why particularly Natick is involved, and I'm here talking to you guys tonight. We are really blessed to have so many active and engaged communities in the Charles River watershed and a part of the Climate Compact. This model is definitely specifically focusing on the sort of upper and mid portions of the Charles River watershed. The lower Charles River watershed, where Brookline and Boston are, is going to be hopefully addressed in some future phases, maybe as a separate project or potentially as a part of a continuation of this project. In terms of Natick's involvement in this project, Natick serves as the fiscal lead for this particular grant project. The funding for this work in both phase 1 and phase 2, which you guys are hearing the results of tonight, was funded in part through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which is a great program about building resiliency in our communities that's run through the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. As a part of that grant program, in order to apply for grant funding, you have to be a municipality. So one of the municipalities, Natick in this particular instance, serves as the lead for a number of regional projects like this. Natick's been really lucky to serve as the fiscal lead on this project, but it's really, truly, we're just so excited to see how the model is benefiting so many communities. The sort of individual priority projects that are sort of being moved forward into design is just a really great representation of all of the great work that a model like this can do for communities, both on an individual level, but also looking at things on a regional level. Julie mentioned that, you know, we need to be aggressive. There's lots of scenarios that we're worried we might not be able to mitigate. And so looking at things on a regional level can help sort of make things seem a little bit less of a burden on individual communities, because it truly is going to be all of our problems in the future. I'm going to keep my statements really brief because we've got some really exciting stuff about community engagement following up. But if anybody has any questions, they're welcome to reach out to me about Natick's participation or other municipality participation in this model. And I hope you all get a chance to use the model viewer when the update's released after the 30th. Thank you all, and I'll toss it over to Leigh.
Awesome, thank you so much, Claire. So I'm just gonna take a moment here to share my screen. And actually, while I'm doing that, before I jump in, I think one thing I wanted to lift up is But, and actually, I feel like was in a lot of ways how we try to embody a lot of the community engagement in this phase of the project. Thinking back to even earlier this evening, there was a quick technical situation, and Dira handled it very gracefully, and in a lot of ways, I think embodied kind of what we're thinking, like, oh, we need to be flexible. Like, just because it's been a couple of years doesn't mean that we know how to do everything, right? Or there aren't things that we need to be considering, you know, related to flexibility and being open to kind of what's occurring in the moment. I think about things like we're coming back in person, and so you'll see some of the things that we'll share here, and the events that we did were in a lot of ways connected to, hold on one second, sorry. In a lot of ways, with them being in person, required us to sort of go back in time a little bit and remember what it means to get together in person. And when you're doing events, like even things as simple as, oh yeah, easels, tables, where do we have those stored away? Are they collecting cobwebs? So just like, that was a lot of what I feel like coming back together was, and moving slowly and deliberately, I think, when we're doing this work, and being, again, flexible and patient with each other. So, so yeah, that just kind of reminded me of that. So anyways, my name's Leigh, working here again specifically with CRWA, communities responding to extreme weather. And a lot of our focus, again, was around engaging, how could we engage and empower communities related to the flood model specifically, and getting information out to people around that. And then also, you know, being more active in helping people to prepare for flooding impacts. As I mentioned, CRWA is the organization that I work with most directly, and CRWA very deliberately has the name that it does. I think because it's more about wanting to relate to people and meet people where they are. And a lot of times that has to do with what people's most direct experiences are, and a lot of that is more around extreme weather, as opposed to be able to grapple with some of the broader concepts of climate change. So a lot of the work that we do is direct community. As is mentioned here, you know, focusing on our work as equitably as possible to really empower people, and really focus a lot of our efforts on active engagement with community, whether that's through mutual aid and learning, and as mentioned here, service and planning efforts. So I'm gonna, because I think people here probably want to hear a lot more around what was learned from community members. So I'll do what I can to kind of breeze through some of these first slides. Just wanted to lift them up though, so that at least they're here in the recording. As mentioned, engaging watershed communities, what are our focuses when we're out there in the community? I already started to mention these. Awareness, so sharing out the flood model. Education, in what ways can we be out there to help people understand some of these concepts around nature-based solutions and green infrastructure? And then also being active in terms of flooding preparedness. When we have people's attention, how can we also be a resource in that engagement? Engagement considerations. So again, this is an ongoing effort, as Julie mentioned, from last year. So what are the things that we were considering in this new moment? And one is thinking about the feedback from phase one. So we wanted to make sure we were weaving that in. So prioritizing language support, doing more hyper-focused or hyper-local outreach, which is really great when you're doing it in person, because that means we're in each town and city in direct contact with people, and maximizing our existing relationships, which is where the trust already exists. So why would we not go there first? Thinking about COVID, and again, new moment with that, and how are we flexible? The seasons, we were coming into warmer weather from winter into spring and early summer. And what does that mean for opportunities to engage with people? And insights and requests specifically from municipal staff with some of the events, and then also our own commitments to things like inclusion, as I mentioned, meeting people where they're at, and then also really committing to reciprocity, right? The people we're engaging with, there's abundance within each person and community, and how are we making sure that we're sharing with each other, and that we're grateful for that exchange. So a lot of what we did focused on sort of three buckets. Was the direct tabling, as mentioned, so and specifically targeting as we could environmental justice populations in some of the municipalities, and we were at lots of different events. Again, thinking about timing and seasons. End of April is Earth Day. Places have eco weeks. There's farmers markets coming online, and then thinking about community or cultural events that were also happening. I highlighted here faith groups. I think because we actually, as mentioned, CRWA in my bio, I think, when Dira read it out loud. CRU has a lot of deep connections to faith groups specifically. And we had actually organized one of our virtual events was going to be like a flooding preparedness workshop for faith groups throughout the watershed. And we just found that nobody was signing up for it. And we had to just, again, roll with it and say, you know what, that's okay. It's a new moment. A lot of it was thinking about the timing. People are coming back together in person. And as much as we're grateful for people to be here this evening, it's also a beautiful night. And a lot of people probably want to be outdoors in ways that, and with each other in ways that we haven't been able to the last couple of years. And so that was just, I think, really valuable for that learning as well, to put something together and then also let it go. Climate Vulnerable Communities Workshop was something we also organized specifically for municipal staff, because in addition to connecting with community members around flooding preparedness, is, you know, being in direct contact and communication with municipal staff and however we can support them in being more empowered to be in dialogue with their own community members around how to prepare and what it means as far as some of this projected flooding, what that means for the communities, what people's experiences are going to be. So just wanted to lift up one specific effort we did was in Medway, and this actually weaves in what we did in Medway, weaves in some of the ideas I mentioned earlier that we were prioritizing, right? So we want to meet people where they're at. What are some ways in to being in dialogue with people? And so when we went to Medway it was Medway Pride Day, and we were going to be there for, I think, about 6 hours engaging with people. Again, we thought a lot about, you know, who do we need to be in contact with in advance, around what we could prepare and for our tabling. And we came up with some great ideas. I think one was basically like a bean voting count. And so we had some great images of things actually going on in Medway. So it was a very nuanced approach to talking about some of these green infrastructure strategies. So not just using some of these terms that people might not be able to wrap their heads around so much, and speaking more directly to what's actually going on in the community. So things that like groups like the Medway DPW are really excited about and wanted to get some feedback on from community members. So we came up with a fun activity for that allowed people to like physically, you know, put beans into the jar and be able to offer their insights and their vote for what they were really excited about. Another activity we did as well was, again, thinking about place. Medway specifically, that event was on a parking lot. So we're talking a lot here, right, about reducing impervious surface, and we're at an event that is on an impervious surface that is radiating heat. So we also did some stuff with like a heat gun and thinking about ways we could show people in real time and that felt experience of what it means to be on a hot surface versus go 20 feet over there to the grass, and what is the difference there, right? So we just thought about ways that we could work in some more active elements to our tabling. And then other things that we did as well was, you know, just thinking again, how we mentioned earlier about preparedness and any way that we could provide resources. As shown here, just some emergency kits. And in the bottom right-hand corner, one thing that we did that people were really excited about was we had these emergency blankets that we could give out. And that was a great way in. People would come up to grab emergency blankets, and then we would enter some really fantastic dialogues with people. So some learning, some celebrations. I'll just highlight, again, run through these real quick. Things to celebrate. What were we able to accomplish here? We had some fantastic, meaningful engagement with 300 plus watershed residents, again, primarily in person. There was an online survey about green infrastructure that we were able to funnel people to. We established some great inclusive resources and practices for staff members. And then again, thinking from here, how we're growing together just in terms of the number of relationships that we're going to have going forward. I'll just share here as well, just a couple of slides on learnings. I'm actually just going to read off some of these. So things that, what I did is go through some of our notes and try to find some themes in what people were sharing. One was just as far as nature-based solutions, people, families, kids are so excited about trees and rain gardens. It was fascinating to hear people talk about living on hills and so they're safe from flooding. And I actually really appreciated one of my team members who was there with me for one of the tablings. I was witnessing her in dialogue with someone who said that, you know, we live on a hill, so we're safe. It's not our problem. And rather than her turning to them and saying, well, it sort of still is, like, it's going to be a thing over time. And rather than focusing on them as the individual, they said, well, what about your neighbors down the hill? Do you know them? And watch people go, oh my gosh, I don't really know what their experience is, and saying, you know, how about reaching out to them? So a lot of our dialogue with people, when people sort of either naysayed or didn't really see how flooding was going to impact them, was try to expand those dialogues to include the broader community, and like just thinking about people's relationships to others in the community that they might care about, even if they're not directly impacted. Zoning concerns for sure. People here have been talking about it with development this evening. Asking about how they can get more actively involved. And then people were, like I said, were super stoked about the emergency blankets. And then the last really primary slide around learnings. This is just things that we're taking away, I think, for next phase and continuing relationships and outreach. I just highlighted here, I think the big one really is centering relationship, right? As I mentioned earlier, slowing down our process. This is an urgent issue, but we want to make sure that we are moving at the speed that people need in order to really be engaged and to feel like they can respond effectively. These are just some things we're going to do next. Increasing our cultural events that we go to, things like with the YMCA. We've been talking about Paddle Boston, which has locations all along the river. And so how can we, you know, be focusing on locations and reaching communities based on their proximity to the river itself, having focused dialogues with the most impacted communities, and then connecting people with resources in their community beyond just our two groups, CRWA and CREW. So I'll leave that pretty much here. Again, we all can start preparing together. CREW created a pretty fantastic community vulnerability toolkit that you can access online, and we can make sure to send that out to you as well. And if you want to reach out, there's my information, and then Vernon, who's our program manager. And I think that's about it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Leigh. And thanks so much to all of our speakers for their great presentations. Now we're going to open it up to our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please include them in the Q&A box. I already see a couple of questions that have come in both the chat and the Q&A, so I will start with there. But I also want to note that Leigh said we came up with a lot of things, but I'll be honest and said that Leigh was kind of the mastermind behind a lot of the ideas, especially the bean in the jar idea, which I thought was really innovative. And so I just wanted to credit her since that was all of her idea. All right, so one of the first questions that came in the chat earlier had asked about why Brookline wasn't part of the model. And I think Claire had mentioned it a little bit, but I was wondering, Julie, if you could answer why Brookline wasn't part of the model, as well as why the model is only for the upper and middle part of the watershed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I will definitely answer that question. It's a common one, actually. So it's great that we have engaged folks from Brookline. I do just want to echo Dira's thanks to my other speakers and their awesome partnership. As you guys can probably tell, both CREW and Weston and Sampson are just amazing partners to have on this whole project. And then thanks to you, Dira, for moderating. That was my fault when I threw you for a loop with the screen share. We were trying to get our Facebook Live going. So yes, thank you all for your flexibility on that. The model was intended to kind of fill a need for freshwater flooding information where there was none. So when we launched the Charles River Climate Compact back in sort of late second half of 2019, at that time, the communities of Cambridge and Boston, which drain into the Lower Charles, both had pretty detailed models for their cities. And so they were able to do that modeling to identify where freshwater flooding would occur, both from the river overtopping, should the river overtop, or from their stormwater system. So those already existed. It was the remaining areas in the watershed that did not have such a model. So initially what we looked at was the area of the watershed that drained down to the Watertown Dam, right, you know, on the Watertown Newton line, if folks are familiar with that. And then we noticed that that area actually excluded some pretty important parts of both the communities of Watertown and Newton. And we wanted to include both of those municipalities completely. So the model then went a little bit further downstream, but essentially it includes the area from the Watertown Dam up. There is a very small amount of very small area, I should say, of Brookline that is included in this geographic extent that is in this model. But the bulk of Brookline drains to the Muddy River or to the Lower Charles. And so therefore it's out of our geographic extent.
Great, thank you. Our next question was about when will the projected higher rainfall storm scenarios be required to be incorporated into state and local mandated stormwater management plans for new development projects? So I'm not sure who would like to take that first, but I'll open it up to all of our speakers.
I would just say soon, hopefully. And, you know, Claire, I don't know if you'd want to comment on kind of what, obviously it's, you know, with each municipality does have their own process. There are a number of municipalities across the watershed. But one of the reasons we are doing this as a group and as a region is so that we can all, you know, take action together, strengthen numbers, essentially. But as far as just that process on the local level, Claire, maybe I'll let you speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so Natick's in a pretty unique situation because we were sort of already in the process of updating our stormwater bylaw this year in order to better comply with MS4, and it just so happens to align pretty nicely with some of the updates in the rainfall data. So hopefully those new rainfall projections will be incorporated into Natick's stormwater bylaw in the next couple of years or so. I know not every community has the luxury of having staff who are sort of dedicated to these sorts of updates because they do take a big effort and there's a lot going on for municipalities. And I feel really lucky to be supported by my community in these updates. So I would agree with Julie. I would hope that communities work to incorporate it soon. On the state level, I know things move at their own pace, so I won't try and make any projections about that. But I expect that with MS4 requirements and a potential update coming through that permit structure, that these rainfall projections will likely be required to be included in things in the next 5 years or so.
Claire and Julie, I'd just like to add to that in terms of the state projects. As I mentioned in my presentation, the updated rainfall projections developed by Cornell University are actually, they're coming through the state, through EEA's Climate Hydrologic Risk Project, and they have been incorporated into the state's Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, which is available live now and accessible by anyone, any municipality, any individual, any state agency. In fact, state agencies and state-funded, state grant-funded projects are actually recommended and are encouraged to use those updated projections. And they are making their, the updated projections are also making their way into state capital projects. So I would say that those are definitely well-poised. Updated rainfall projections are well-poised to be integrated into both state and local projects.
Great. So our next two questions, I'm going to kind of combine them both, and I think they are mostly for you, Indrani. The two questions were, in what ways were the model validated, and how are the improvements to existing infrastructure, so our storm drains, culverts, like dealing with bottlenecks, undersizing, aging of structures, incorporated into the base model or various scenarios?
Yeah, thanks, Dira. So in what ways the model was validated, we actually calibrated and validated the model. So we calibrated the model to a real storm, the March 10, 2010 storm, which is approximately a 48-hour, 50-year storm of record historically. The model has been calibrated to 6 stream flow gauge locations across the watershed, all USGS gauge locations for that observed storm. And it has been calibrated for both peak flow as well as total flood volume measured at those gauges for that particular storm event, as well as the timing of the peak. And all of those calibration parameters have shown an improvement with the details, the additional detail that we've added into this phase of the model. So I would say that the calibration of the model holds ground and holds true in this phase. And then the model that calibrated model has also been run with the storm that was recorded last summer from Hurricane Ida in September of last year, early September. So we've been able to use the model to validate observed flood conditions from the recent historic storm event. And then the other question related to what extent, and I'm sort of scrolling to that to see the question, to read the question again, in terms of how the improvements in existing infrastructure are being incorporated into the model. I mentioned that we consider this model to be a living document, and as drainage and flood infrastructure improvements get implemented, specifically the large-scale ones, some of the major flood mitigation projects get implemented, final design and construction happen on those projects. It is really the intent of this project, of this model, and of this project team to keep the model live and updated with those improvements, so it's always the best available. So it serves as the best available information to date for the communities to assess their level of risk, as well as for citing other flood mitigation projects. So we have been able to incorporate some of that information, certainly through the phase 1 and phase 2 of this project, but the intent is to keep updating the model as that information becomes available.
Great, thanks so much. Our next questions, also 2 questions that I'm going to combine. I think Leigh would be great for you to answer, and Claire, if you have any input in terms of working at a municipal level. Someone had suggested or kind of posed it as a question if we have paired up with community health centers. And the second question was, are residents in environmental justice communities aware of the status of their neighborhoods? I assume in terms of flooding and the impacts that we are seeing using our flood model.
Sure, thank you, Dira. Yeah, so that first question, actually, it was, I know it said community health centers, and I immediately thought of, and not that it's not, wouldn't necessarily be titled as a community health center, but the YMCAs, the reason we noted them is actually thinking about sort of health and wellness across populations, and just the way in which places, I don't know if others are members of the the YMCA to me is a magical place in terms of just the diverse, expanded, groups of people that access the Y, and even just like the trusting relationships or people's understanding about places like the Y, the role that the Y many roles that the Y plays in the community. So I guess that's to say that's actually one kind of moving forward with this project, that we've actually been in dialogue with many Ys throughout the watershed now, and we actually have it marked down, like the Ys go back to them, I think, very intentionally in the sort of next phase of outreach. I think I noted specifically Healthy Kids Day is just something that happens every year where hundreds of kids are at each of these from across the watershed. So these just feel like some pretty obvious ways to be out there with people. I think to the other question about environmental justice populations, sharing it mainly just from what I sort of was able to bear witness to when being in dialogue with people in community. I'd say it depends. At a lot of the events that we were at in person this spring, we caught, I think, as far as more like the Earth Day events and that kind of thing, and the festivals, we caught a lot of families and kids, which is huge, because then that also has expanded impact. You're out talking with people, and then when families are talking with each other, kids are back in schools. So that I just thinking about the ways in which people are reached in that way. So I would say there's been some great success potentially reaching people in communities in that way. Looking forward, people also might have seen I breezed through a slide that had the Healthy Kids Day on there. And on there, we mentioned a place called the Mill, which is an old lower income senior housing development on the river in Waltham. And so again, and we found them through relationship with Waltham Land Trust. So coming back to your question about who's been reached and they know that they're in these neighborhoods, moving slowly, building relationships with trusted people, and through them, people are we have relationships with some of these groups, and it's those local leaders that are making recommendations for who to then be in touch with. And very recently, we've been in touch with staff at the Mill and residents who are super excited about us coming there to do some direct engagement with them. So, but that's like a 3-step connection, you know, which is really, in some ways, I feel like more meaningful because you're reaching more people that way. But there's certainly more work to do, I would say, especially for individuals in environmental justice communities. And Clara, yeah, I'd be curious in Natick specifically.
So it actually sort of ties in almost directly with what you're saying. It's about reaching out to those communities, finding folks who you have an established relationship, and then working through them to help establish a relationship with the larger neighborhood. Natick is actually currently participating in another MVP grant, regional grant with Ashland and Framingham to build what we're calling a climate community liaison relationships, where we've sort of compensated folks for their time to help build relationships with the community, engage in survey work to sort of get an idea of the people in those neighborhoods, how much they're aware of in terms of climate change, climate resiliency, and how much they're aware of in terms of the programs and resources available to them. Those 3 communities have sort of been actively working to engage and create those relationships. That work is due to continue through the rest of this summer. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to engage further. So like Leigh said, it happens slowly but surely. And I think that a lot of communities are taking a really focused look at how we can engage better with these communities that have had less than stellar engagement in the past, likely because of the formats or the times of engagement that just don't work with their schedules.
Great, thank you for all of those answers. I want to take a moment to note the time. It is 7:47. I believe we had it scheduled for 7:45. Correct me if I'm wrong, Julie. So I assume some people will have to leave, start their dinner plans, but I wanted to take a moment to thank you everyone for attending our webinar tonight. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the recording of tonight's webinar in English and Spanish. There will also be contact information for Julie and I believe all of the speakers if you need to contact them for various reasons. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of our speakers for their time tonight. And I think we have put in the chat a link to the model, but there will also be all of the follow-up information in the email to check out our model. And also please keep an eye out for when it will be updated with all of the new modeling and solutions. Julie, I don't know if you want to add anything else as well before we close out.
No, I'll just echo thank you to the attendees, thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to Dira.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a good night.